Hello, everyone. I said hello. Yes, there we go. Thanks for coming out to this session. It's a very tough time slot, but that's always the case at NDC, I guess. I wanted to give you a presentation that I wish someone had done this for me at least 12 months ago, because it was about 12 months ago, or maybe a little bit earlier than that, when a couple people that I really respect said you should take a look at Node, because I've always been a web developer, but primarily on the Microsoft stack. So even today, I'm still building stuff with Visual Studio and C# and ASP.NET MVC and Web API. But they encouraged me to check out this environment, and so I started taking a look at Node. And of course, at that point, I had a perspective on Node that I think a lot of people might share, which is I thought Node was for building server-side web applications, web pages, web APIs, that type of thing. But what I found that I really liked about the Node environment were some of the tools that you can use that don't run on the server. They run at development time or they run at build time. And those are the things that I would like to walk you through, because starting about 4 months ago, when I launched into a new project, I decided instead of using things that are available in Visual Studio or are available in ASP.NET MVC or available with Visual Studio plugins like Web Essentials, I was going to use Node tools instead. So I will show you some of those things. Why was I doing this? Because I was trying to start a new project that was slightly forward-looking and take advantage of specifications that are getting pretty solid right now. Things like HTML5 and JavaScript, ECMAScript 5 and CSS3. But even pushing the edge just a little bit and looking at some of the newer APIs and ECMAScript 6 features that are coming out, I wanted to start taking advantage of those. And the problem in the Visual Studio environment is that Visual Studio has to support ASP.NET and JavaScript and things from all over the place. But when you look at the Node environment and you try to find out where are the cutting edge tools being developed for the next version of HTML and the next version of JavaScript and all the new CSS things, it's all happening in the Node universe, because Node executes JavaScript, and there's a lot of JavaScript developers in that space, and it is very friendly and open to open source, so a lot of people are building tools to work with the latest stuff. So let's first I want to give you a really brief introduction to Node, just in case you haven't seen it before. Yes, it runs on Windows. You just go to the website. You can click install. It'll give you an MSI that you double click on to install it. It's only a 10 or 12 megabyte download. Hanselman's session is very noisy, isn't it? And what is Node? It is literally the same JavaScript engine that is inside of Chrome, but it is packaged into an executable so that you can run Node from the command prompt or from anywhere. And once you have it downloaded and you have installed it, let me first show you that you should have a Node.js command prompt. When you click that to open it, you'll be in a command prompt where Node is in your path because it's been installed under program files somewhere. So you would be able to type Node, and if that's all you do, you essentially get a REPL. So you could say, what's 2 plus 2? That's a 4. What if I do var name equals Scott? I get back undefined because the expression was assigned to a variable and there was nothing to compute there. But if I say name, yes, it is Scott. If I say name.to uppercase, it's uppercase Scott. And there's even some auto-completion help. If I type name dot and hit tab, there's actually some introspection there that can tell me everything that I could do with a string. I could replace it, splice it, split it, and things like that. So that's sort of interesting, just having a REPL. And actually, I found that useful sometimes when I'm trying to figure out things with, like how a date behaves, and I want to find what numbers are available on it and how to transform things into the proper time zone. But you can also, once I Control-C to get out of here, create scripts that run in Node. And now if I zoom out, what I should be able to do is say something like name equals Scott, console.log name.to uppercase. So kind of the same thing we had before, but now this is saved into a script file called hello.js, and I should just be able to run node hello.js and spit out the same result. So yes, you can build web applications with Node, and that's usually a process of downloading a framework and starting it up with Node, telling it to listen for HTTP messages on a specific port. But we're not going to look at the server stuff. We're going to look at things that actually run here in the command line. So that you can run them on your developer machine, run them on your build machine. And there's lots of people creating command line tools that are built on top of Node. We're going to look at some of those. But just to give you an idea of what you might be able to do is there is a tool out there to search Spotify that is built on top of Node that'll come back and show you things from Michael Jackson, and you could play one. The problem is that really only works on the MacBook. Doesn't work on my PC. You know, most things are going to work on Windows just as well as they work on the Mac, but there's the occasional package that you might download for Node that only works on the MacBook because it's doing something special with hardware or a speaker or something like that. To understand how to get to those things, we're going to look at a Node package manager to pull down and install these tools. It's a lot like NuGet. In fact, we're going to look at several different package managers because there is a package manager for Node modules and Node tools that will download libraries and executables that run in Node. And then there are package managers for client-side stuff like how do I pull down the latest version of AngularJS or Bootstrap CSS. That's a different package manager that runs on top of Node. I'll show you that one. There are task runners that you can download. Task runners are all about automation. Gone are the days when you would just write some JavaScript files and inject them into a browser page using some script tags. These days we write a lot of JavaScript and we want to lint the JavaScript, concatenate all the files together, minify it so it's a very small download. We might even want to do some transpiling. So we want to go from CoffeeScript to JavaScript, or we want to go from ECMAScript 6 and write the latest JavaScript, but have it transpiled to ECMAScript 5 so it can actually run in the browsers that are available today. So we'll basically be looking at setting up a JavaScript build process using two very generic task running tools. And then there are generators out there. So you want to do some scaffolding. You want to build up an application structure really quickly. I'll show you a generator that is available. But all of these things, the gateway to get to all of them is through a tool called NPM, which is installed when you install Node, so it should just be available. There's a tremendous amount of activity in the NPM repository, which is where people will create an open source project to search Spotify or minify JavaScript files, and they'll bundle things up into this Node package module, upload it into that repository, and then you can install things. So if you're familiar with NuGet, it's just like NuGet. I want to install a package. It's going to live in a specific location. I want to update all my packages. There's a way to just say, yeah, go out and update all the packages that I have installed for this project. In fact, so the NPM is a tool that you run from the command line. I can type NPM, and it'll bring up a help screen saying I can do things like install, I can do things like update. And when I install things, there is a package manifest, which I will show you, that is a file that lists everything that I have installed for this particular project. And things are installed in one of two places. If I just type npm install and some package name like Spotify to do that Spotify search, the default place will be in the directory that I'm in under a subfolder called Node Modules. And Node really makes a distinction between two types of things that it downloads, just libraries that need to be referenced or included in some larger project, and binaries, which are things that you want to execute, like that Spotify command that I did. But typically, you don't run binaries from your local project. If you want to run a binary like Spotify, or if you spell it correctly, then that is one of the tools that you would want to install globally with a -G switch. So that goes into a different location on my hard drive, and it's a place where I can reach that tool from anywhere. And you can see the location there. That's typically when Node installs. It'll set that up in your path for your computer. So anytime you open up a command prompt, anything that you've installed globally, you should just be able to run from the command line. It just works. I could do something like npm install bower-g. So Bower is one of the tools that we're going to look at, and depending on the Wi-Fi connection, this might or might not make it. It'll go out to the repository, and much like NuGet, sometimes download zip files or tarballs, bring them down to the local hard drive, explode them out, decompress them. It also understands dependencies, so you can see a lot of things scrolling by now because Bower is a tool that depends on things like the underscore library. And so the person that builds the Bower package will just describe those dependencies in a manifest file so that NPM knows how to bring down everything that Bower needs. And it looks like we completed. And since I installed that globally, I can just type Bower now. And we're going to talk about what Bower is. Yes, so an example of using NPM from the command line. A lot of the command line tools for Node use a CLI prefix or suffix so that you know it's a command line interface package as opposed to a library that you might reference. And here are the basic NPM commands that you want to know. So first of all, when I am in a brand new directory and there's nothing inside of it, but I'm ready to start up a project, I might want to run this npm init file. What npm init will do is ask me a couple questions and then set up a manifest file for me. So let me just create a temp directory and say npm initialize. So what is the name of my project? It's temp. What's the version? I can put in whatever version I want. So just a bunch of basic questions so that the end result is a JSON file which looks like this, which you don't need all of this stuff all the time, but this is the name of my project, the version, and then we're going to see that anytime I install something for this project, it's going to be listed as a dependency inside of this JSON file somewhere. So backing back out for a second. Whoops, wrong button there. This is a package.json file for a project that has a runtime dependency on a Node module called Q, which is quite popular for asynchronous programming. And it has a development dependency on a tool called Grunt, which we're going to look at. So NPM does allow you to make a distinction between things that have to be there for it to run in production, like the Q library. I need that because the program actually uses that. And then development dependencies, which are the things that other developers will need on their workstation in order to be able to do a build. And then when you npm install something like Q, npm install Q, you can specify --save to make sure that entry goes into the JSON file as a dependency. Or you could npm install a tool and say save dev to tell npm that this is a developer dependency. So put it in that dev dependency section. And then those will all go into a folder called node modules. So let me come over here into temp and say npm install q-save. That installs Q, very small library, so that was very quick. Look at package.json. You can now see that is a dependency. And if I go into node modules, there will be a Q folder there. One of the nice things that NPM will do is always install these things into their own dedicated folder. And it's actually pretty good at managing dependencies because if Q did have a dependency on some other library, let's call it foo version 1, that will actually be nested under here. It won't be another top level folder. And that just means if I install two things, and one depends on foo version 1, and this one depends on foo version 2, since those dependencies are nested under those separate top-level folders, it actually all just works. And part of that is because of the way the node module system works, because those pieces are completely isolated from each other when they're running. But then, what you typically do when you're working on source controls, you don't check in the node modules folder. Just like with NuGet, it's quite common to not check in your packages folder with all the binaries in it. Instead, you just check in package.json. So another developer comes on your machine, he clones the repository, gets down package.json, and then he'll just type npm install, and that will look in the JSON file and say, oh, I see you're using Q, let me bring it down and put it in here. And it can track specific versions and things like that. Making sense so far? Quite wonderful. All right. Those are the npm basics. And of course, there's an uninstall command. One of the things I want to install, which I installed globally already, is a package manager called Bower. So a different type of package manager. npm is all about stuff that runs in Node or on top of Node, where Bower is a package manager that is dedicated to packages like AngularJS, Bootstrap, Ember, Durandal, Animate.css. So anything that is a JavaScript library or framework, like everything from jQuery to underscore to Angular, or anything that is a CSS framework, anything that loads into a browser, there's a 99% chance there's going to be a Bower package for that, which is one of the reasons I switched to Bower from NuGet for front-end packages. Well, actually, there's a couple reasons. One reason is anyone today who is building a JavaScript library or framework, the first package management tool they are going to target will be Bower. So as soon as they release any sort of new build or patch or fix or anything like that, the Bower file will be updated instantly, and you can come by 5 minutes later and say Bower install or Bower update to the latest version, and it'll be there. Whereas NuGet is very much, I don't want to say it's a second-class citizen, but there's a lot of people writing JavaScript that don't care about NuGet. Someone else, a third party, has to write a NuGet package and a new spec file to bring that package up that JavaScript and get it into your project. So that's one reason I prefer Bower for JavaScript and CSS. The other reason is that, quite honestly, NuGet just has not done a good job of figuring out a convention on where to place stuff. So if you've been through this experience of NuGetting Angular, jQuery, Bootstrap, and all these other front-end tools, they get dumped in all sorts of places inside of your project, sometimes under the scripts folder, under the content folder. They fill up quite rapidly. Bower is very unopinionated about how a package should be put together. I'll show you that. It's a bit disconcerting at times, but I do know if I say Bower install Angular, I know exactly what folder it's going to go into, and it's going to be a folder dedicated to that Angular package. I don't have to worry about it filling up another folder inside of my project somewhere with both minified files and unminified files and source maps and all that other stuff. So Bower, you get started using that command I used earlier, npm install Bower-G to install it globally. And once you have done that, you will be able to Bower install different packages. The one catch is that Bower, npm sort of stands alone. If you have Node installed, you can use npm. You don't have to install anything else. If you install Bower, the way it builds packages is to rely on a Git client of some sort. So you will have to install a Git command line tool into Windows, and you can do that with Git for Windows, which used to be called msysGit. I've even had it work with PoshGit, which comes from the GitHub client for Windows, which is a nice graphical user interface, but it also taps into PowerShell to add some Git commands to it. So Bower will work with either one. Just make sure you have that Git client. And now, just like NPM, everything we learned about NPM almost directly applies to Bower. There is a Bower init command that will create a JSON file for me that describes all the packages that I'm going to store. When I Bower install a package, I can say, please save that as a dependency, or please save it as a development dependency. And then I don't have to check in my Bower components. All I have to do is check in bower.json is the name of that file, and then other developers, when they clone the repo, they just say Bower install, and poof, Bower will bring everything down and keep them up to date with what I wanted everyone to have. And then there's Bower update, so I just want to update every possible package to the latest version that's out there. Always a little bit dangerous, because when you update everything and change to the latest version, something inside of there will break. So you'll spend a few minutes debugging things. But let's say that I wanted to come back to the previous folder I was in, that was under a desktop folder, unfortunately. There we go. And you can see inside of here, I already have a JSON file. One of my only dependencies right now is QUnit, because I want to show you how to run some automated tests from here. And that's a development dependency, because I'm not going to run QUnit in production. But let's say I wanted to use AngularJS. I could bower install, or even jQuery, bower install jQuery, goes out, fetches jQuery, and I forgot to put in -- save, so I would have to come back and make sure I do that to get it into my JSON file. But once that is complete, let me open it up Explorer here. I will now have not only node modules, but also Bower components, and inside of Bower components I can see some things that are in the correct location. I actually installed some things here which are not in my JSON file, and I actually don't need some of those. But there's jQuery, and here's the disconcerting part. Bower is not opinionated about what people should put into their packages, or what is the folder structure that should be underneath of this package when it has expanded. So when I Bower install jQuery, I can be guaranteed that jQuery will always appear in that folder. But let me give you a different example here real quick. Let's Bower install Jasmine, -save. And while that's happening, I'll just show you inside of jQuery, there's a dist folder. Now, usually, that's where you want to go. I want to go into the dist folder, because that's where they put, the files that you want to use. That's the distribution. So there I can see jQuery, a minified jQuery, and a source map for jQuery to help with debugging. And there's a lot of projects that will follow that same convention. All you have to do is drill into there and find that distribution directory. But then there's things like Jasmine, which if I come into the Jasmine folder and go into the distribution folder, there's zip files, which aren't immediately helpful. What I really want is to find a jasmine.js file and a jasmine.css file. Jasmine's a test framework, in case you haven't used it. And if you poke around enough, you will find it in here. I believe it's under lib, if I remember. These are the files that I actually want. Usually those 4 load into a page to run some unit tests. So there's a little bit of inconsistency there, and no one really documents where they put stuff. They just expect you to be able to Bower install and figure out where it went into that folder. But it's always there somewhere. And was that all I had to say about Bower? Oh, if you're using Visual Studio, so this is kind of my common workflow now. Inside of a project I might start in Visual Studio, ASP.NET MVC, I will check in my bower.json file at the root of the web project, and I will have my Bower components folder included into the project, but not, if I'm using TFS, I wouldn't want to include everything, because then TFS likes to check everything in. But I might cherry pick out specific files from Bower components that I include into the project. That's not necessary at all. So this Angular folder might contain 50 directories inside of it and 10,000 files, but really the only thing I care about from inside of Visual Studio is that one JS file that has to get loaded up. And I might pull them into the project like this, just because then Visual Studio understands that JavaScript a little better. You can drag and drop that file into a web page and things like that. Otherwise, developers open up the project file. If the Bower components folder isn't there, sometimes it's a little bit confusing. So I will include that there. If it happens to be a bigger solution that has multiple web projects inside of it, then maybe move Bower components out to the root of the solution. So all of those Bower components can be shared from multiple web projects, and just link them into that particular project. That works well. So now that you have all of those front-end tools downloaded, now you have to figure out, how do I take this JavaScript and concat everything together, minify it, I'm writing so much JavaScript that I might want some sort of linting tool to run through it and tell me if there's any potential problems with the JavaScript that I have. Well, that's where tools like Grunt and Gulp come in. So we'll talk about Grunt first. It is the oldest task runner. Well, I don't know if it is the oldest, but it's certainly more mature than the other one we'll talk about. What you do is you define tasks for Grunt, like I want you to look at this directory, concatenate all the files together, write a new file into this folder, then minify it, all those sorts of things. You can do that all with Grunt. The way you install Grunt is it's one of these command line tools that runs on top of Node, but there's a few command line tools for Node that follow this pattern. First of all, you're going to install some piece of it globally, and that allows you to go up to the command line and just type Grunt. But typically, that piece of software is a very small wrapper around a local installation of Grunt that will install in Node modules underneath the current folder where you run npm. And the basic idea here is that Grunt CLI is brainless. It's just there so you can type Grunt from the command line. All the real work's going to be done by that local installation of Grunt. But that approach, what that allows for is if there's ever a breaking change in Grunt, you can still have Grunt version 1 for this project and Grunt version 2 for this project and still be able to run Grunt from the command line and not worrying about having to keep all those things in sync, because they both have their own local copies of Grunt that when I type Grunt, it just gets forwarded to that. So what are some of the things you can do with Grunt? Well, if you like to write CoffeeScript or TypeScript, you can use Grunt to compile those files into JavaScript. If you write less, there's a Grunt task to compile less into CSS. If you use Handlebars or a framework that depends on Handlebars, you can pre-compile handlebar templates so that they are executable JavaScript, and then that doesn't have to happen at runtime and can save you some performance. There's optimizers for required JS modules, JS Hint, which is a wonderful tool to scan your JavaScript files and say, you know, you're doing something that looks a little bit fishy here. Maybe you should fix that. So let me show you a Grunt file and the different types of tasks that we can do with it. So if I open up gruntfile.js, the way a Grunt file works is there's just three major pieces. First of all, the Grunt file that you write is written as a Node module, so you have to do this module.exports equals function. That's literally saying, hey, I'm building this function that I'm going to give to you that you're going to invoke and pass yourself in, and inside of this function I'm going to tell you everything, all the configuration options that you need to know about. Then there's this init config section. Before we talk about that, let me scroll down to the bottom and just focus on these things first. These are tasks that I need to execute. So uglify is minification, JS Hint is linting, QUnit is a unit testing framework, watch is something that can watch the file system and run stuff whenever a file changes, and concat puts everything together. These are all additional modules that I would need installed, Node modules that are going to run in Node. So if I want to use JS Hint to lint my code from a Grunt file, one of the things I will have to do is npm install grunt contrib JS Hint, which I already have installed, so I'm not going to do that again, and I would usually do that with a -- save dev. So npm install grunt contrib JS Hint save dev, so that module is available to load in when Grunt is executing. You know, that's the code and the logic behind the hinting. And once that is installed with npm, then you tell Grunt to load that npm tasks. That's basically like establishing an assembly reference. You could think of it that way. And now, once that is available, and we'll focus on concat first. Once concat is available, when I init this configuration file, I basically need to tell concat what to do. So I want you to build a distribution of my files by looking at all the JavaScript files that are in this source folder, concatenating them together and putting them into a single file called demo.js, which is in the destination folder, or distribution folder, sorry. Let me come to that folder once and just show you that I can blow some things away inside my distribution folder. Let's get rid of everything inside of there. So that's basically empty. And then I can come in, and now that I have that grunt file, sorry for making people nauseous by zooming in and zooming out, now I can say grunt concat, and by default grunt looks for a grunt file in the same folder, and I told it to run concat, so it goes into that configuration and says, what is concat? Oh, I see that task. I see that you wanted to build this distribution.demo.js file. And so that just happened. Now I have demo.js, which is actually just a short demonstration of putting two other JavaScript files together. Then, oh, we still have time, right? Yeah, okay. Phew. We got slides to go through. Here's Uglify. So I want to minify that file now. I want you to look, I want you to build demo.min.js from that file. So let's go over and do a grunt uglify. And it'll tell me, hey, great, you just saved 10 bytes by squishing down that file. If I look at st distribution demo.minify.js, yeah, it stripped out some carriage returns and some white space, I guess. And we can continue going through this grunt file, but you can see individual tasks here that are set up. When I run grunt QUnit, I want it to load up all of the HTML files that are in my test folder and execute tests inside of a tool called Phantom.js. Anyone here of Phantom.js? Yeah, it's basically a headless web browser. So it's a web browser that doesn't have a UI, doesn't appear on the desktop, which means it's a great browser to use for things like on your build server or from the command line or for continuous integration. Unfortunately, it does have some drawbacks. It's based on WebKit, but it's not always up to date. It doesn't have some of the ES5 things that I need sometimes. But yeah, basically run my QUnit tests in Phantom.js and tell me if things pass or not. So I just have a single simple test inside of there, and it passed. And then JS hint. Oh, let me show you some JS hint things actually that are interesting. So this file, let me open up in source. Oh no, sorry, in my test folder. I have a little bit of JavaScript here that works, but there's an issue with it. In JavaScript, there's no block scope. You probably know this already. There's no block scope in JavaScript. So if I declare a variable inside of a block like this, inside of an if condition, it's as if I had declared that variable at the top of the function. So there's no real point of using the var keyword and declaring a variable inside of here. And the problem is I'm declaring it inside of here, and I might be thinking JavaScript has block scope, and I'm referencing it out here. It's just a mess. Well, these are the types of things that JS hint can find. Currently, this option is called func scope. You look in the documentation for JS hint, func scope is an option that if you set it to true, it will no longer check for that particular condition where a variable is declared inside of a block and then used outside of it. But if I turn that flag off or remove func scope, and now I go back and say, dear grunt, please JS hint my files, it will tell me that X is used out of scope. So it detects that problem, and that's when I could come in and someone could fix that file by, well, could initialize X to some initial value, and only if true is true, then we could say X is 3. That would fix that problem. I should be able to run this again, and it'll be happy. So those are individual tasks that I'm running with Grunt. And typically what you do to set up a real build system then is you define other tasks that can execute those subtasks. So if I type grunt test, I want two things to happen. I want JS hint to run over all of my files, and then I want QUnit to execute my unit test. The default thing, which is what will execute if I just type grunt with no other parameters, is to go out and JS hint things, run the task, concatenate everything together, basically build a distribution after all the tests and hinting has completed. So if I just type grunt, it will go off and run all of those steps for me. So that would be something that I might do during a build. And I could register as many of these different tasks as that I want and use different combinations here. Now what I also have set up, though, is a task in here called watch. So it might be that as I'm developing, I want Grunt to continually watch things in my file system. And this is a template syntax. This is basically saying, watch all the same files that are specified here. And if any of them change, do these two things. Immediately run JSHint and run QUnit. So if I come out and type grunt watch, then it'll tell me it is watching and it's waiting for something interesting to happen. And if I come into like a simple.js file and save it, you'll see there in the background grunt just runs everything. Runs the test, runs JSHint, which is interesting. Now, I do occasionally run into problems with the file system watcher with grunt watch where it doesn't detect changes or it doesn't detect changes in a specific folder. And I thought that might have been a Windows thing, but in talking to people that use OS X, it also happens there sometimes. But sometimes just rebooting or resetting it helps. The other thing I've had problems with Grunt is if you start Grunt Watch at 9 o'clock in the morning and then you work all day and then maybe shut down the computer and come back to it in the evening, if it's been running for 10 or 12 hours, sometimes it starts creating these temporary files in the file system that you can't delete, and it starts missing watches, but just killing it off and restarting it works pretty well. Questions so far? Live reload. I don't have a demonstration of that, but I like live reload. So live reload is a way to tell Grunt that the watch task specifically to also set up a little server that listens on a specific port, and then you can download an extension for Chrome. An extension from the Chrome Web Store that sits right there in your menu, that if you click that, it will communicate with the web server that Grunt has set up so that anytime a JavaScript file changes, yes, all the tests will run, JSHint will run, but it will also tell the browser to reload the current page. So you just get you save a file and everything refreshes, which is kind of nice. So the advantage to Grunt is if you go and look at what Grunt plugins are available, you will come to a page on their site that says there's almost, as of this morning, 3,000 different entries, 3,000 different things that you can npm install and then load up into your Grunt file and do different tasks, things like compile from TypeScript to JavaScript, minify all my images, compile my handlebar templates, minify my HTML, run my Jasmine specifications. If I'm using require.js, I can go through all the requires and figure out the dependencies and do some optimizations. Angular templates is a neat little plugin that I've used because in Angular you use a lot of partial views or HTML templates that are scattered all over your web server, and every time you load up a directive or load in a new ng view, Angular has to go off and fetch that HTML. That package just builds them all together and concatenates them and loads them into a special place in Angular called the template cache, so they're already in memory as soon as you download all of them, as soon as you download the JavaScript file that comes out of that. Lint my CSS, lint my JSON file. So all sorts of wonderful things out there for Grunt. The downside to Grunt is, at least for me, and I know other people that feel this way too, it's a mentally taxing exercise to modify a non-trivial Grunt file because you write all these object literals that are strung together, and it's very easy to forget a comma, get the source out of whack. It feels like writing XML configuration after a while, just writing all these objects everywhere. So a tool that came along much later than Grunt is a tool called Gulp. And it does the exact same things. You install it the same way. I np install globally Gulp, which installs a little wrapper out there. I npm install locally this Gulp tool. Save that as a development dependency. So the difference between Grunt and Gulp is that whereas Grunt feels very declarative about the way you build your tasks out, Gulp, you write more imperative code. You actually write JavaScript functions and have a sequence of statements inside of them. Let me show you a Gulp file. Well, and that's one significant difference. I'll explain another one here in just a bit. So that is our grunt file, and let me open up, by killing the watch, the gulp file, and scroll down a little bit. And now you can see, here's grunt, here's gulp, grunt, gulp, grunt, gulp. It's like an exercise. Instead of writing object literals that say, here's my configuration, what you do is say, I want a task called concat. What I want you to do is go out and grab all these source files, and it also understands globbing patterns. So if I say *// it would say inside the source folder and everything underneath of it, recurse through all directories, pick up all the JavaScript files. What I want to do is pipe them into the concat task, which knows how to take 10 files and put them into one. And the pipe is very significant because gulp really has these isolated tasks where you say, okay, I want to concatenate things. So you have this grunt concat task, which puts everything together, writes out a file. And then another step, which will read that file, do something to it, write out another file, or overwrite a file. With gulp, what you can do is use streams. This is using Node streams behind the scenes so that there's not as much file system activity. You know, read all these files and just pipe them through memory to this other task to concatenate things, and then pipe them through to this other task that knows how to write to the file system into the distribution directory. And so gulp concat, just like grunt concat, will build a single file for me with all of my contents put together. And I can do the minify, I can do JS hinting, and these tasks don't have to be isolated like this. I could just have a task called build, which goes from concat and pipes into this and pipes into that and pipes into another thing. Let's look at this. Not as many plugins available for gulp because it is newer. And I'm still using grunt files for everything, but I want to migrate to gulp. I find that managing that file is a lot easier. And I should also show you down here at the bottom. And there's fewer packages, but all the big ones are there. So you want to watch things, you want to run QUnit, you want to run Jasmine, concatenation, minification, all the things that you probably need are there. Here's my default task. Just like my grunt file had a default task, I have a default task here, which is run lint everything, run the unit test, concatenate everything, minify it. And there's a watch task where I can say basically watch these folders. Anything changes in there, run test. And I would probably want JS hint inside of there too. Anything in this folder changes, run this thing called tracer, which I'll talk about here in just a second. So that's grunt and gulp. If I were to be starting a new project today, I would try to start with gulp, personally. Yes, next slide. Yeoman. Yeoman is not a tool that I've actually used extensively. I'll explain why in just a bit, but I know some people who have a lot of success with it. It's basically a generator. So if I don't want to start a grunt file from scratch, or a Jasmine test from scratch, or an Angular application from scratch, then I can go out and npm install Yeoman globally. And at that point, what I could do, let's make another directory called Angular NDC. I'm going to build an Angular application. Whoops. Come on, fingers. Angular NDC. And I'll type yo Angular. And what that will do is scaffold out an application for me with Angular.js set up. It'll ask me a few questions here, like do I want to use Twitter Bootstrap? Sure. I want to use these different Angular modules? Sure. And it'll spit out a whole bunch of stuff, including the Bower files that I need and the npm package.json file that I need. And this is all wonderful, but it's all oriented really for Node developers. So if you try to take this particular thing that is being generated and use it from ASP.NVC, it becomes a little bit difficult just because the folder structure doesn't always line up the way you want to. And if you've ever thought that File New Project inside of Visual Studio put out a lot of stuff, you can do that from the command line too. It doesn't require UI to put 50 megabytes of stuff on the hard drive. So that'll continue for a little bit. The interesting thing about Yeoman, though, is in addition to scaffolding out big things like an entire application, and this would also include everything I need for Angular, inside of that scaffolding engine is also some interesting things which I want to look at and how to tweak to see if I can use them from something like an ASP.NET MVC project. Let me kill this off. Yeah. Because now, once this is set up, I could say, yo, I want to create an Angular controller called NDC sessions. And this is nice just because sometimes when I do want to create a new controller in Visual Studio, it's a bit of a pain to go out and say, oh, create this controller file over here and create the test file for it over here. That's kind of nice to have. That gives you a nice little scaffolded start. So if I go to app, scripts, controllers, NDC sessions.js, that's the start of a controller that I can use. And if you go out and look, there's documentation on how to build your own generators, your own scaffolding. There's lots of people writing all sorts of custom generators. So there's people that have written generators for Angular, I know, that will dump out a data access layer for a particular web API or a service layer for a particular web API. It's an interesting technology. I just wanted to mention it in case it's something you could make use of. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention actually is Tracer. So when I started a project a few months ago, we were trying to be very forward-looking with this particular project because it's going to be around for hopefully more than 5 years, maybe 10 even. And we decided it would be interesting if we could work some of the ECMAScript 6 features into the application, because there were a few things that I particularly like about ECMAScript 6. The problem is if you write in ECMAScript 6 right now, it's not like you can just deliver that JavaScript to a browser like Internet Explorer 10 or even the latest version of Chrome. It doesn't really support everything. However, there are transpilers out there like Tracer, which can take ECMAScript source code and rewrite it so it can run in an ECMAScript 5 browser, potentially with just a few additional polyfills inside of it. So I started exploring Tracer. I'll be honest, the verdict is still out a little bit on this. But here are some of the things I would like to do. Let me open up a file. Let me go back to, I should have done a push D to that folder, NDC Oslo Node Tools. Here we go. And open up under my source folder. I have a file called employee.js because this uses an ECMAScript 6 class definition. There's really crazy things coming in the next version of JavaScript. A JavaScript class that has a constructor, so I can use the new keyword and say new employee and pass in a name. This is a default parameter in ECMAScript 6. That's something we could do today by saying something like name equals name or some default value. But it's a little more intention revealing when it looks like this. In fact, it looks a lot like C# at that point. There's property getters and setters. There is a let keyword, so let does give you true block scoping. If I were to say something like if true, let x equals 3, that really would live only inside of that block. There's also a const keyword, so I can say x is 3 and it always has to be 3, throw a runtime error if someone tries to write into that variable. This is one of my favorite parts of ECMAScript 6, kind of on an ECMAScript tangent here, the arrow function. Looks familiar if you've done any C#, right? It really behaves almost the same way. If I want to write a function called square, instead of saying let's write a function that takes a parameter x and returns x times x, what they allow you to do is get rid of the function keyword, get rid of these parentheses, get rid of the curly braces, just use the arrow operator or the goes to operator. Don't need a return keyword. Looks just like that. If I wanted something that took 2 parameters, that's when you have to use parentheses and return x plus y. If I want something that doesn't take any parameters, it's empty parentheses, console.log, hello. Just like C#, right? Just like C#. That's something I want to use. Oh, because the other huge advantage to arrow functions is, I have a member out here, which is this.name, right? And if you've probably experienced this problem where if you do anything asynchronous, like have a set timeout call or an HTTP call, if I try to say console.log this._name here, does that work? probably not, because my this context has changed to be something else. It's probably the window object now. I don't get that reference. You guys have run into that, or you've seen something like var self equals this to prevent that. With arrow functions, if I use an arrow function here instead of the function keyword, and yes, you can still have parentheses in the definition. It can be multiple lines. The this keyword lexically binds to the outer function where it's defined. So those two will be equivalent, which is kind of nice. Don't have to do as much self equals this type stuff. But anyway, to get this to actually work anywhere requires tracer. So if I look at my gulp file, I have a task set up for tracer to take that file and build it into a distribution folder, including some experimental features that are inside of it. So if I gulp tracer and then look in my distribution folder, that's what it comes out in. Uses the tracer runtime, so you have to include that too. So still experimenting with this and trying to figure out if it's something that's really safe for production or not. But I do know other project teams that are doing this, like the Angular team. They're actively writing stuff in ECMAScript 6 and using tracer to transpile it into a current version of JavaScript that actually runs in browsers and things like that. So I think it's worthwhile for everyone, even if you love Visual Studio and you love C#, and you're doing a little bit of JavaScript, to at least take a look at some of these node tools, because I have found they've been very easy to work with, and I honestly feel that they have made me more productive, and they're good for the products that I am building. So, questions? Yes?
Is there any chance of using these tools together with the MVC web API?
Oh, so can I use these tools together with MVC Web API?
Compiling, testing.
Yeah, I mean, Web API is all server-side stuff. You could certainly, if you're building something that uses that Web API with JavaScript and all, certainly use these tools to lint the JavaScript and all that.
Not sure if that is the question, but can you just, like, are there plugins for you to run MS Build or compile your view?
Yeah, sorry, I got that now. I haven't tried this, but there are grunt and gulp tasks that allow you to execute shell commands. So you could certainly shell out to MS Build. Yep. Thank you. There was another one.
I asked that question the same.
Oh, same thing. Okay. So you just want to replace like MS Build
Yes.
with yes.
XML with JSON.
I think it would be possible, and I know the next version of ASP.NET, which is being described over here, relies on a JSON manifest instead of a CS proj file. So this might be the direction we're headed in any case. More questions? Well, thank you for coming. I'll hang around here if you do have any questions, and if you want to contact me, I think my name's Scott Allen. I'm relatively easy to find. If you just Google for Ode to Code, you can find a way to get a hold of me. Thanks for coming.